Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the NASAGIS Sea Level Rise seminar. We're very glad to have Nadia Seeteram. She is a postdoctoral research scientist at Columbia University's Climate School, and her current research is focused on understanding multi-sectoral policy solutions for reducing climate risks across US housing markets. She received her PhD in Earth System Science at Florida International University, where she researched the dynamic long-term impacts of sea level rise on coastal communities and their implications for future climate-related migration. She has held research positions at the US Environmental Protection Agency and the New York State Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. Nadia is also a Climate Security Fellow with the Council of Strategic Risks at the Center for Climate and Security. And today she will be speaking on the topic modes of climate mobility in response to sea level rise. So, welcome, Nadia.
Thank you, Patrick, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, especially on the week, right before the Thanksgiving holiday. I'm going to present some research that was just recently published and then maybe preview some of the research that sort of supports it, which also I just found out is in press as of late last week. And so it hopefully will tie together, some of the quantitative work that we've done to try to understand how people, to try to address this question of how people might become mobile in response to climate hazards in the future, and then what exactly are the experiences of people on the ground right now. So I will get started and hopefully leave plenty of room for questions. Patrick, does everything look okay with the screen?
Yes, looks good. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is this research that I'm presenting today. Again, was recently published about a month ago, and so it's available online at Environmental Research Letters if you'd like to read a little bit more about it. I will obviously be discussing it in depth right now. So to start, I'd like us to travel to South Florida. This is where I did my dissertation research in Miami-Dade at Florida International University. And so in South Florida, as you probably are very well aware, sea level rise is a huge, really existential question for the region and its and its survivability throughout the rest of the century. And it's really because of some of these numbers that you see on your screen here. This is a chart that is put out by the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. It is a compact that is administered with the 4 counties in South Florida. That would be Miami-Dade County, Broward County, Palm Beach County, and Monroe County. And they all get together really to sort of share information on sea level rise planning. And one of the things that they do is they produce what we call the Unified Sea Level Rise Projections, which is this chart on the screen. And every 4 or 5 years, they update this. So this is the latest set of projections. And they use this across the counties to hopefully kind of somewhat standardize sea level rise planning information. So based on just what we see in terms of the different trajectories here, we could have anywhere, potentially a little bit beyond a foot of sea level rise in Miami-Dade by 2040. And then, of course, we have, some of these higher end projections. From what my understanding, people in the region are, of course, in conflict about which trajectory to use, but I've heard for the most part, that actually the NOAA high is seriously considered in some of the planning activities today. And so I want to focus a little bit more on Miami-Dade County of the 4 counties because, well, it was the county in which I went to school, but it's always held a special place in my heart. It's highly exposed to the impacts of sea level rise. Before we produced our own estimates for the study, the estimates that we were working off of came from Climate Central, and it predicted that a 2.6 meter rise by 2100 would affect more than 2 million residents. It's also just a highly economically unequal landscape, and that really is a product of the of just the way that the city developed. It is a Jim Crow city. It is a place where redlining and the sort of discriminatory past is very much alive in the spatial sort of distribution of racial and ethnic groups today. It's also a place of refuge for many people across the Caribbean and South America and Central America. And so it really has a really interesting, there are these really interesting conflicts about what is, Miami-Dade's place in terms of both being a place of refuge and then also being a place where many residents still face quite a lot of discrimination. And what I found to be very interesting about Miami-Dade is they're fairly proactive. Again, the South Florida region is proactive in terms of planning for sea level rise. They have plans. Miami-Dade in particular has a sea level rise strategy. It has a resilient 305 strategy. It has many different plans, but none of the plans include the words retreat, displacement, or migration in relation to sea level rise or any climate related hazard. Which is very interesting because when I started my dissertation, these were the headlines that were really prominent, back in around 2019, that, the impacts of sea level rise are here and they're having two types of effects on the communities. There are the questions about how do we address sort of the direct impacts of sea level rise, these floodgates, these flood walls, are we going to have home relocation? And then what about the indirect impacts as people are starting to internalize the direct impacts of flooding? People are tending to, or what there is evidence that people are moving towards higher, safer, resilient areas in the city and causing, climate-related gentrification. There's a lot of questions around that, but this is how at least, this story was sort of playing out in the media. And so just taking a step back, Miami is a very interesting place. It's a super small sliver of land on the Florida Peninsula, and it's really surrounded by water on all sides. You've got the Atlantic Ocean and Biscayne Bay on this side. You've got fresh water in the form of the Florida Everglades on the western side. Miami's the surface, the geology of Miami is very porous. So oftentimes, when there's, especially nowadays, when there's a lot of rain and water doesn't drain out, water tends to actually come up from underneath. And that happens both in coastal and inland areas as well. And then it's a subtropical climate. So we have there is a wet season in Miami from May to around October, November, where it rains very heavily. And so really water on all four sides. And so flooding is just a part of life, and contending with flooding is just a part of life in Miami. And this photo again sort of illustrates some of what I've just said with saltwater intrusion from the Biscayne Bay. You have a very small sliver of land in Miami called the Atlantic Coastal Ridge. These are the highest points of elevation of Miami. When I say that, I mean maybe 24 feet is the highest point, so very low-lying area, and that includes some of the areas to the west as well. And we have a very intricate canal system that is part of the water management system of South Florida, an aquifer right underneath it. So again, water on all sides, and flooding is a huge challenge has been a huge challenge for the region in the past and will continue to be for the future. So that's all to say that the risks of sea level rise really extend beyond the coastline. They don't just sort of stop at, at the water's edge here, where you might expect some of the impacts of flooding. And so sea level rise really presents this sort of dynamic, evolving spatiotemporal risk affecting communities across Miami-Dade in various ways, again, because of the higher points of elevation in some areas and the low-lying elevation in others, and just all the water that the county must contend with. And so I tend to think about these in two different ways, as one, sort of the direct impacts of sort of flooding, and that can include tidal, coastal storms, pluvial flooding, and of course compounds, so some combination of one of those three, and then the indirect effects. So when people start to internalize the effects of those direct impacts, you have the flow of capital, people to these sort of safer areas for long-term resilience. And so it's sort of, again, really those second order impacts. And we wanted to put these, or I wanted to put these two these two dynamics together and kind of understand how both of them will contribute to migration and displacement in an area like Miami over time. And so that's where we, develop this framework. And what this framework does is that it posits that there are 4 different types of climate migration pressures. Again, either from sort of in a combination of both the direct and indirect impacts. And so you have increasing exposure to sea level rise as one sort of driver or one sort of pressure of climate migration, and then increasing social vulnerability on the other side. And it produces these 4 really distinct pressures, and I'll walk through each of them. So the first one, and this framework, again, is just a method for sort of categorizing different communities across time and in terms of which pressures they might face. So for example, we have this stable sort of community. This is stable relative to the other categories. So these are areas across Miami that generally have greater flexibility, greater capacity to mitigate any kind of risk, but in general, they don't really have many risks. They're they're on higher elevation, and they don't really face any of the impacts of sea level rise or related flooding. But then on the same side of that socioeconomic spectrum, we have the migrating communities. These are communities, as I just sort of showed, those living in luxury high rises right on the coast, more wealthier, have more ability to actually mitigate the risk on their own. And because of that, they might be more likely to just up and migrate, up and leave. They can do that from their own on their own terms if they wish to. There's also quite a bit of evidence that we have that shows that more disaster-related benefits sort of flow towards these communities because they have greater capacity to kind of navigate the federal bureaucracy after to receive them. And there is some evidence that shows that they have generally greater social, political capital, and these communities are more likely, and their corresponding municipalities are more likely to actually administer a home buyout as well. Now, moving along the sort of increasing sort of social vulnerability axis, we have those who are not directly impacted from sea level rise or related flooding, but have increased social vulnerability. This group represents what we call the displaced communities. These are communities that would face those indirect impacts as people, as capital sort of move to these areas. If there's nothing really, no policies that are in place to help them sort of withstand some of those economic forces, they could be displaced, they could be forced to sort of leave those areas. And then finally, we have what we call trapped communities. This is a term that's really emerged from the literature that is the combination of, that reflects the combination of both being highly exposed to the impacts of flooding and sea level rise, but also having lower flexibility, lower capacity to mitigate risks on their own, and really being sort of trapped in their circumstances. So again, these are the 4 types of, broadly categorized mobility pressures that we wanted to kind of explore in this area. And so to sort of visualize how this might play out through time, we had to do a few things. One, we needed to find a way to assess social vulnerability in a way that was really locally relevant. For those of you who have had experience with social vulnerability indices, like the Center for Disease Control's Social Vulnerability Index or the SOVI method, they're very much they're rendered very much at a core scale at the county level, and we really wanted to be, we wanted to try to be as produce this analysis as granular as possible. So we had to develop a set of locally relevant indicators to measure vulnerability within the county itself. And just broadly speaking, we used a model-based clustering algorithm to develop sort of social vulnerability profiles for our analysis. Then we needed to find a way to actually assess flood exposure with sea level rise. So we partnered with researchers at UC Irvine to calibrate PRIMO. This is a high-resolution regional street model that renders high-resolution regional model that renders street-level flood depths. And we did 2 types of analyses here. We looked at flood exposure for 100-year events plus sea level rise, and then sea level rise alone. from 0 to 3 meters of sea level rise. And then because we had such granular flood exposure data, we really wanted, again, to try to make this, to produce as localized of a analysis as we can. So we decided to try to measure exposure at the building level. And that really required us to build a data set that contained residential buildings in Miami-Dade, and then sort of downscale population into each of those units so that we could more accurately assess flood risk exposure and the mobility pressures through time. So I'm going to talk about each of those a bit more in depth, starting with social vulnerability. So in terms of defining social vulnerability, we defined it as the characteristics of a person or community that affect their capacity to anticipate, confront, repair, and recover from the effects of a disaster. We chose to measure what we call relative vulnerability, and I'll explain what that means in a second, rather than measure absolute vulnerability. Again, for those of you who've had experience with some of these social vulnerability indices, what you usually get is a number from 0 to 1. And it sort of, is indicative of, okay, well, 0 being the least vulnerable, 1 being the most. If you have some, area that is like 0.36, it's supposed to indicate some kind of low to moderate vulnerability. We found that to not be especially useful. And so we decided to use instead this sort of expectation maximization algorithm to produce model-based clusters to really identify areas of similar vulnerabilities across a scale of social vulnerability. And so we essentially used the exact same data that would go into, the sort of absolute vulnerability scales using census data and data from the Housing and Urban Development Agency. We were able to instead develop profiles. And this is what I mean. So on the left-hand side, you will see a map of Miami-Dade County and all the different census tracts. That's the unit that we used for this analysis. And some of these tracts are highlighted in variations of green, but they all sort of reflect lower vulnerability profiles. So the nice thing about this sort of clustering method is that you can see vulnerability within and across sort of communities of similar profiles. So for example, the lightest color, profile 1, represents probably the lowest vulnerability areas across Miami. And it really does map onto areas of sort of the highest income, as you can see on this scale. So I should explain on the bottom here, we have all of the distribution for each of the indicators listed across here, and only income is just sort of measured in sort of dollars, but everything else is measured in terms of a percent. And so you can see that, across these lower vulnerability profiles, you have you will always have a higher amount of foreign-born persons in Miami. That's just a feature of Miami. It doesn't necessarily indicate vulnerability, but if combined with higher distributions of limited English speaking skills, that might indicate some kind of vulnerability. But for the most part, these are people who have access to vehicles, are not necessarily living at the poverty level, have very low rates of unemployment and uninsurability, and have higher incomes across the median, which is around 52,000 at this time. Then we have the sort of moderate vulnerability profiles. So we have those split between profiles 4 and 5. And again, what you see is a picture of more middle class, more working class communities across the county. You can see that there is a higher percentage of foreign-born persons, and now a higher percentage of limited English speaking skills. But for the poverty of people, those living above the poverty level has risen slightly. Income has shrunk. Uninsurability has risen. And so again, the reason that we chose this way to measure vulnerability is because it actually tells us something about the communities, about the specific processes that might actually drive vulnerability. And the idea there is that you can then intervene in a very specific way. And then finally, we have the higher vulnerability profiles across the county. You can see here that there's a high level of racial segregation, as I mentioned, in these areas. incomes are very well below the county median. The uninsurability rate is quite high. Those receiving public benefits, those living up at the poverty level, the limited English speaking skills, especially for profile 8, you can see are really clustered in these areas. And so again, this was our approach to social vulnerability. So then the next part of our method, again, was the flood modeling. This is where we partnered with researchers at UC Irvine to calibrate PRIMO for the Miami-Dade County. If you're not familiar with this model, it was also published. These researchers, Brett Sander, Joe Schubert, had developed a really wonderful model, and they've also applied it to the greater Los Angeles area, and that's featured in this Nature Sustainability paper. So this is what it kind of looks like for Miami. I'm just giving you a really up close look of how the model, what the model sort of produces. The nice thing about it, and I think this is our composite extreme flooding scenario at just sort of the baseline 0 meters. And what you can see from the legend is that you have flood depths there that really correspond intuitively to a body part, making it really to sort of facilitate participatory flood modeling and engagement with stakeholders. And we find it's a really intuitive way to sort of do that. But the detail here is incredible. This is an area of downtown Miami and a little bit of Miami Beach. And again, I'll show you what that looks like for the whole county now. So again, we modeled 2 different types of flood hazards, inundation alone, and then these sort of extreme 100-year flood events under 3 different sea level rise scenarios. Our inundation mapping used pretty much sort of a bathtub approach that was hydro conditioned to reflect some of the canals and drainage in the area. And then our extreme flooding scenarios is actually a composite, and we modeled 3 different flood risks in that composite. So precipitation, storm surge, and groundwater. And so this is a map of with the corresponding flood depths here. On this side of the entire Miami-Dade County, you can kind of see these, sort of lighter areas really do map on to the higher points of elevation. But as you can see, in just sort of this, and sort of an extreme flooding scenario, there is just a large part of the county that is affected by some kind of flooding. And as we start to add sea level rise to these scenarios, you'll see the deepening of those flood depths across the county, especially in Miami Beach, here in Key Biscayne. These sort of darker areas all sort of reflect these canals and rivers that kind of run through Miami, so areas really surrounding those. And then at 2 meters, you really see that, well, most of Miami Beach is inundated, as well as Key Biscayne, but also these western areas. Again, as I mentioned, they are lower lying. And then by the time we get to 3 meters, this is often a scenario in South Florida that is referred to as just this barrier of this chain of barrier islands that is the ultimate result of a very high sea level rise scenarios. Okay, and so finally, we wanted to find a way to combine both that rich, social vulnerability data and this sort of granular street level flooding exposure. All the people that are inundated. So having a more granular analysis really is, can you hear me?
I think we lost you for a second there.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll go back to this slide. So hopefully you heard me say that, being able to measure population at the building level will really improve our estimates in terms of who data. And so we had to use the property descriptions to basically once they were combined, filter out the commercial from the residential. And that was quite time consuming to match the property descriptions with the residential buildings. And then for the most part, what we did is we, dropped all the non-unique sort of property descriptions. So we only had unique residential buildings. And then we used that the 3D buildings data to calculate the building volume. And that would essentially help us redistribute the population and disaggregate the population from each census block group into we use a very simple proportion to essentially divide the population into each of the buildings based on the volume. And that really does help improve that redistribution. So from there, we have a few results. This is from the sort of flood exposure analysis. So again, on this, on the upper right-hand corner here, this is what the Primo looks like for the Primo model looks like for the extreme sort of flooding scenarios between the 0 and 1 meter scenarios. You can see quite a difference here. And then at the bottom, we have, again, just the 0, 1 meter, 2 meter, and 3 meter scenarios divided by the dominant flood driver, because I mentioned we used, our composite was what included both precipitation, storm surge, and inundation. And so what you really see is from 0 meters, precipitation is really the dominant sort of flood hazard or the dominant hazard here. And it affects about 15.8% of the current population. But by the time we get all the way to 3 meters, and really between 1 and 2 meters, there's a shift in that in the driver there, and that is the inundation. The groundwater becomes the sort of dominant driver between 1 to 2 meters, whereby in this scenario, about 54% of the current population is affected. And I should say that we measure affected versus non-affected using these thresholds. So for inundation, we use a lower threshold since it would be more of a permanent state of around 3 centimeters. And then for precipitation or storm surge, we measure that by around the flooding or not flooded threshold by around 30 centimeters. And this, what you see here again, reflects the driver that has the highest flood depth across all of these scenarios. And so again, this is a really massive state shift, and this is really important for Miami, I think, to acknowledge, because so far, most of the planning is very much concerned with these coastal sort of areas and not really sort of responding to these sort of long-term threats. And here we have a breakdown again of how that breaks across sort of the social vulnerability profiles. And then again, just by flood hazard driver here. So U being unaffected, P for precipitation, S for storm surge, and I for inundation. As you can see, again, from 1 to 2 meters, this shift from precipitation being the sort of dominant driver to inundation is really quite reflected there. And across all groups, I mean, you are seeing sort of the redistribution. The blue, the number 4, just 4 and 6 just sort of have the highest amount of population distributed into those profiles. Now, what does this mean for mobility? And so after kind of, using this sort of information, we were able to classify folks or communities into the sort or buildings into stable, migrating, displaced, and sort of trapped. And so, for example, if you not flooded, but in a low social vulnerability profile, we categorize you as stable. If you are flooded, but in a low social vulnerability category, we categorize you as migrating. If you are not flooded, but in a high social vulnerability profile, you would be displaced. And if you are both flooded and in a high social vulnerability profile, you would be in the trapped. And you can see how this sort of changes through time. For the most part, most of the population is not flooded or affected in these 0 and 1 meter scenarios. That's why the displaced numbers are so high. What I think is really relevant here is looking at which populations are categorized as migrating or trapped under these two scenarios. And then as time progresses, those communities that are still stable or displaced reflect residents that are really living at the highest elevations in Miami, and you can see that this trapped district, most of the population is resorted into the trapped category as time progresses. And so we did this analysis then by municipality because we wanted to understand what are the fiscal implications for Miami-Dade. It's a county of around 2.7, 2.8 million people, and there are 34 municipalities in the county. And so we essentially, recategorized all populations, or we recategorized the population of each municipality and broke them apart through the mobility categories. And so at a 0, sort of meter sea level rise, of course, most people are still in that sort of displaced category. Only a few municipalities are sort of have 50% or more of their population sort of impacted. But as we move to just 1 meter, that changes quite significantly. We have about 9 or more municipalities that have 50% or more of their residents categorized as migrating or trapped on just a 1 meter scenario. So this is not to say that they will lose 50% of their population, but it is to say that these populations will find it, will be at an increased risk for asset devaluation, future insolvency, if there are no adaptation measures taken today. And because it's such a large proportion of their populations, these are really questions that they need to start confronting now, especially if there are repeat especially if there are repeat events that could really place quite a lot of strain on these municipalities. So main sort of takeaways here. The population exposed to extreme flooding increases from 15.8% at 0 meters of sea level rise to 92% under 3 meters. Only 5% of residents are considered displaced and 3% considered stable at 3 meters. Again, these are the residents that are living at the highest elevations across the county. Municipalities with the largest trapped residents have overwhelmingly Black and Hispanic populations. And again, Miami-Dade is majority Hispanics. So that is to say that we did see trapped. That is the only one sort of connection that we found between mobility categories and racial and ethnic distribution. And I should say that the results presented reflect potential mobility pressures. They are not predictions. Given existing levels of vulnerability, that is not something we can change through time. We can only change our flood exposure. Current population estimates, it's really difficult to sort of do this. We tried to figure out if we could use maybe the SSPs, but that data is just not resolved for these local scales and without consideration to adaptation interventions. The hope is with an analysis pressures are different across communities through time to better prepare for all of the impacts of sea level rise. So that is this particular study. I'm just going to preview, just with a few slides, a study that we did to really try to understand how well this framework reflects lived experience today. And it is in press as of last week, and so it'll be out very, very soon. It's called Living with Water, Evolving Adaptation Preferences Under Increasing Sea Level Rise in Miami-Dade County. Essentially, in this study, we did about 40 in-depth interviews with residents across the county and 597 online surveys, shorter surveys, to really try to understand how, what our preferences for in situ adaptation and versus climate mobility, what is driving that, how are residents thinking about this now and in the future. And so just to sort of start by saying that in line with our, with our primo results, rain-related flooding is the dominant flood hazard driver right now in Miami-Dade, with about 75% of respondents saying that they've been impacted by some kind of rain-related flooding in the past 5 years. And again, about 70% of the survey respondents saying that in the past 5 years. That's around from the years 2016 to 2021, roughly. In terms of how people have been impacted, we find that around 13.2% of people have actually experienced major damage to their vehicles, sort of engine damage. And on the flip side of that, interestingly enough, about 1/3 of the sample said that they had an inability to commute to work or school. So Miami-Dade doesn't really have any reliable public transit. And so when streets are flooded, primarily from rain, at this point, it really does pose a huge transportation issue. So you can either miss school or miss work, as was indicated by this result, which I was actually really quite surprised by, or you can face major damage to your vehicle, which would present you with a whole host of other problems. So again, these are really small scale disruptions to the fabric of life, but they are occurring now in Miami-Dade. And this is, I thought, a quote that really resonated with me, because I was surprised to see that it was a third of the survey respondents said that they'd called out to work or school, because only one person mentioned this in the interviews, and he said, most recently, like 1 year ago, there was a full moon, there was a high tide, and it just rained. The water flowed down the streets for blocks and blocks. I had to park my car somewhere else. I had to call out of work because it didn't drain the next morning. It stayed like that for over 48 hours. You could see fish going through the streets of Doral Boulevard that had come up from the canals. So I had originally named this article Fish in the Street, but we had to change it. But I thought this was just really interesting in terms of what they're sort of describing, that overlap between the rainy season the end of the rainy season in Miami, so around September to November, actually overlaps with the higher tide season in Miami now from September to November. And during that time, you have, these sort of compound flood events of both rain and tidal actually impacting people's ability to live their lives in Miami. And that's very much sort of a new normal, sort of, shifting baseline experience for Miami. They've had rainy seasons forever. They've had king tide seasons forever. But now with, these higher tides, with this increased rain, water just is not draining in the ways that it used to. And I thought this quote was also great. You have these huge puddles of water that are incredibly deep, and it's impossible to drive your car through them, depending on the area. If you go anywhere close to downtown, it's like you're waiting for a river of water just to disappear before being able to get anywhere. And as someone who has lived in Miami, I can highly attest to this experience. You never realize how deep it is until you realize you should not go any further. So again, just to get back to this question of who is thinking about leaving, how are people thinking about climate-related mobility, we first had to ask whether or not people were thinking about living in Miami-Dade or considering moving in the next few years. So I thought this was actually very interesting that between our interviews and our surveys, about 40.7 to 47.5% of people said that they were considering moving. To give you some background, this was not a transient population. The median years lived in Miami was around 21, 22 years for both the survey and the interviews. So I was not expecting, about 40 to almost half of the respondents to sort of say that. For the people who said no, it was a little more than a third for both the interviews and the survey. And again, when we asked about whether or not, what were some of the reasons that they would move, affordability by and large was the largest reason. But again, unprompted, people did mention both flooding at around 20% between the interviews and surveys, and also increased heat as well. So again, it might not be the primary reason, but it is slowly being integrated into these considerations for migration. But the preference for staying in Florida is very strong. If we asked, would you live in Miami-Dade for the rest of your life, conditions permitting, and again, 2/3 of people did say yes to that. So it's really interesting, what preferences are and what reality is, and how people are responding to that. So in terms of alignment with the framework, we use the interviews, the participants in the interviews primarily, to kind of get a sense of how well the framework reflected, everyday experiences. And I would say by and large, it did reflect the lived experience, so for the stable sort of category here, people for the most part, didn't really mention that they would want to move. If they did, they said if it was necessary, I hope it never gets to that, but if it's something that makes sense to move when it's for the well-being of me and my family, then yes, I would move, but I would rather not. And that really had to do with whether or not they were actually being impacted. But for the most part, people felt safer in these areas. And that was because they actually decided to live there for these reasons. We were tuned into sea level rise even back in 2009, 2010, mainly because my brother had lived in the Grove for 30, 40 years, and he had told us, you want to be up on the Coral Ridge, again, the highest elevation of Miami, and that's where you want to be, and that's where we are. The folks who were sorted into the migrating categories were really interesting because there was a split here between the renters and the owners. So for those people who owned and had an asset, they felt like they would have to move out of financial necessity. We need to eventually move soon because the values of our houses are going to drop because of climate change. And for the renters in this category, they said, I mean, that's why I haven't bought a property. The idea of being able to make a clean break if I need to, it is appealing, and you cannot do that with home ownership. So the tension between renters and owners, and I should say about 50% of the sample was renters. It was a 50-50 split between renters and owners. It was most prominent in the migrating category. Now, the displaced category is kind of where we saw maybe some inconsistencies with how we experienced it. And that's because I don't really think that the participants really internalized the gentrification component. They were more, they prioritized, whether excessive flooding would really prompt them to move, or those sort of feelings of, of not being safe. So they said, I definitely could foresee us moving if there's enough damage, and that's the only solution, the only choice. Some people did mention affordability, but again, it's like, they wouldn't have it. There was just a lack of choice that prompted these responses. And then for the trapped communities, where we did expect to see, this excessive flooding prompting to move, we saw that as well. But again, much higher in the displaced than I think trapped. And that might be just due to the way that people were sorted into the categories. But we also saw people sort of mentioning avoiding experiencing future impacts. I've seen other areas of Miami be affected by sea level rise, and that's not something I want to deal with, or flooding actually being a primary reason for moving. I've lived these horrible events in the last 2 years that make me have a more pessimistic or more sense of urgency. So again, general alignment with the categories are playing out across vulnerability and exposure. The only sort of main difference that we saw was in the displaced communities. And so that's it for that's all I have for now in terms of just our quantitative approach to really identifying which communities would face these pressures through time, and then some of the surveys and interviews. There's a lot more in that study. Those were just a few. I didn't know how much time I would have. Yes, definitely check that out when it's available, maybe in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nadia. Someone sent me a question in the chat. And it says, how is this data conveyed to and acknowledged by state and local governments in order to plan for predicted sea level rise and mobility impacts? And is this approach to sea level rise mobility assessment being used for other metro areas?
So it's a fantastic question. The study has been, was just published a month ago, so we have not had the chance to kind of go back to, well, what I will say is the Miami-Dade Office of Resilience and the City of Miami, they were partners throughout this entire process from the conceptualization. So they were aware that this is the framework that we wanted to use. They played a heavier role in maybe some of the question design in the survey and interviews. We've been waiting for the study to actually be published to bring them the full results, because we also do have a GIS, an Esri sort of viewer where we've actually put the data on. And so that is something that we actually need to resume. It's just been difficult with all this semester has been, really busy, as I bet you can imagine, but that is something that is in the works. So actually, now that it's been published, now that it's been peer reviewed, we can go back to our partners and kind of say, these are the results, and we would love to sort of continue that those conversations of how this might be used. In terms of how other cities may be using this approach. So we've just been, again, really delayed by the peer review process took quite a bit of time. We have had interest from, for example, New York City officials maybe thinking about this. It is designed, we use Miami-Dade as the example, but the framework is designed to be applicable to coastal communities across the country. It just might have to take a different, it might just have to take a different sort of, it might need to be adapted sort of slightly. I think in Miami, even now, migration is, people are moving into the city, not moving out. But I think the threats are fairly existential in Miami so that you can use this to kind of consider out migration in the future. In a place like New York, for example, I don't know, it would be a great sort of screening, I think, to kind of look at those pressures, how they change through time, but I don't necessarily see the same kind of existential threats as I do with Miami. And so maybe it's more of a tool really for long-term adaptation planning as opposed to depopulation or mobility planning in Miami-Dade. Thank you for the question.
And Jeff has a question.
Hi, yes, thanks for the talk. Have you considered the external communication factors like bridges coming down and roads outside the city getting flooded and airport getting flooded, for example? These will influence how people decide how tenable the city is.
We have not considered that in our approach or in this sort of assessment of mobility. That has been a conversation that I know has been taking place, not necessarily, I don't know, I'm sure it is in Miami, but I know of an example in Broward County where they've essentially, and that's, you're talking about mobility specifically after a disaster related event, which is for the most part temporary. Those movements, don't necessarily stay permanent. This particular framework was designed to kind of consider the permanence of mobility. But to your question, I think that those conversations happen in the context of critical infrastructure and decision making for disasters, and how will critical infrastructure facilitate movement outside of the region when there is a hurricane barreling towards South Florida. So it's not necessarily something that we considered for this particular analysis.
Thanks. I actually have another question,
Sure.
because you've got enough data there to do agent-based programming of the whole system, and repulsors and attractors which make people decide to move or stay, and you can include in that policy repulsors and attractors as well, which would decide. And so you could actually have individual people based on where they live and the character and the economic type and things, and make that into quite a complex sort of video type thing of how people are shifting around. And but you need to do something with network theory and how people communicate with each other as well.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. That was absolutely the intention for the surveys. And so I didn't, for the online survey. So in the new article, and I didn't discuss this in this presentation, we actually we showed people, because we had these amazing flood maps, we showed our participants the flood maps. We asked them to locate their neighborhood or their home as best as they could online, and kind of consider how they would respond in any one of these scenarios. So they could either take no action, they could either move away, or they could, adapt in place. And the hope was to use that for an agent-based model. But I will say that doing that type of work, integrating it in an online survey, is not the ideal way. That was our second choice. We wanted to do this with stakeholder groups. But the time at which this work was taking place was really on the tail end of pandemic-related concerns in Miami, so around 2021. And really, we just could not find partners to do the work. And so that's why we chose the online survey. And I felt that the data were not, the quality was not there for that analysis. And so it is something that we think about, it's something that we hope to kind of improve upon, again, perhaps through some of this, this renewed stakeholder consultation. But yeah, it was absolutely the intention that we did this work with in mind.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
And we have Dr. Maruf.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. And I mean, particularly, I really love to see your categorization of different types of movements. So, did you look like there are kind of another category or community who actually have the capacity to stay the place of origin, whether they have different types of climatic shocks? Because I'm from Bangladesh, so this question particularly in terms of Bangladesh, I'm not enough knowledge about Miami, but in coastal area of Bangladesh, I found some community actually, they have some kind of capacity to absorb or capacity to transform their different types of shocks. Even in literature, it is easy to say to migrate to nearest city or other places, but there are some kinds of vulnerability due to migration, even in that place of origin. So I think there are also kind of community, they can actually resilience in terms of migration. They want to stay because this is very known place. They have kind of social or bridging or bonding. So what about Miami? I'm very interested to know this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I mean, what I would say is that I'm not sure this framework was very much developed with certain communities in mind. It was developed for U.S. communities that have very strong property rights and land tenure rights. And so I don't know how applicable this framework is to other countries at the moment that don't exist within those, that don't have those features. I think that there are, I've actually seen similar categorizations. This is not the first one. This particular framework, well, we've been working on it since 2019. I think around the time everyone was having very similar ideas, and I've seen some of this work applied to developing nations as well. They don't look exactly the same, the categorizations, but again, the idea to try. I can send you some papers that sort of attempt to use a similar framework to identify these communities. But I think as this framework is put forth, it is, as you said, it is in line with communities that at least theoretically have the capacity to kind of facilitate these movements as well. Whether or not they have the political will to do that is totally different. But Miami-Dade has a resilience office. The county has a resilience office. The city of Miami has a resilience office. They have dedicated professionals. The resilience community in South Florida is very robust. There are tons of hardworking people. We're trying to figure out, how does South Florida, Miami deal with this challenge in the future? Has it resulted in, is it translating to movement? Not necessarily, and that's a lot of political will, financing, all of these other things become equally as important as having access to the data and understanding the problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have a question in the chat from Vivian.
Yes.
She said, what steps is the city of Miami taking to prepare for higher sea level rise and increased flooding? And New York City has neighborhoods highly vulnerable to sea level rise, coastal storm flooding, and inland flooding due to heavy rains.
Yes, and thanks, Vivian, for the question. So I would zoom out just one step further, and I would say that the county, Miami-Dade County itself, is actually, again, as I just sort of described, there is a really robust community of resilience professionals who are trying working every day to think about flooding, extreme heat, all the other, challenges that the county faces. And they have the county has put out a sea level rise strategy. A sea level rise strategy, and it identifies 5 different types of strategies for transforming the landscape in the future. And that includes building on fill, that includes increasing blue and green waterways.
Feeling much better today? Oh, good.
Yeah. That also includes building on higher ground, as I mentioned. It does include building like the Keys, so building on elevations, stilts. And so these 5 strategies are what they're hoping will sort of transform the region. I don't know how much progress has, where they are in the next steps, but that vision does exist. It's called the Miami-Dade County Sea Level Rise Strategy.
I have I have been in Miami and Miami Beach in the past, and I know that there's an awful lot of construction of condos right on water's edge. It's been a tremendous amount of development there. How do you reconcile that with the knowledge that, the city is extremely vulnerable to sea level rise? And not only that, I mean, they're dealing with what we call nuisance flooding frequently during even the course of a month.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. It's really, it's their zoning laws and their development practices still encourage it, unfortunately. I think that, I talked to architects in the region, and they're trying to put in these resilient standards. But I think as long as it is, relies on property taxes to fund services, to finance adaptation, we're going to have this perverse cycle of continued development in these sort of risky areas, in order to keep, funding the cities. It's a huge, an unbelievable concern for Miami. And this is also why I've shifted my focus to housing, because I've realized that, well, what are we doing to make these, if we're developing, are we doing anything to make it more resilient?
And are the builders taking into consideration the need for greater flood protection and building that into their, developments?
Well, Florida has some of the strictest building codes in the country. And so I do think that is, depending on where they are, I do think that they're probably adhering to those building codes. Of course, their, enforcement of building code is a whole other sort of topic, but those do exist. And so most people, I think, with new construction, so that retrofitting is a whole other challenge, but with new construction, there is sort of, a challenge to build above a certain base flood elevation. Those probably are being incorporated into new construction, but retrofits is a whole other issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
Okay.
Question from Klaus.
Yes.
A little bit over time, but if I understood correctly, you screened out the commercial sector properties. But my guess is there could be a rather strong feedback mechanism between the presence of low and middle income people and their employment opportunities. So there could be a feedback mechanism that could actually amplify and accelerate any mobility aspects.
You are absolutely correct. We only focus on residences right now because we wanted to understand, the direct impact of flooding, where it would impact people in their homes. And that was just a specific analysis that we wanted to conduct. But I think you're absolutely correct in that. Of course, it goes back to what I showed in the surveys. If the roads are flooded, if you can't get to your place of employment, all of this becomes a larger part of the story of just how flooding is impacting just everyday life nowadays.
Well, I simply wonder how governments need this to incorporate, let's say, in comprehensive planning for the future. Okay. Because then it's not just the residential problem, it's also the commercial aspect that needs to be translated into politics.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that one thing that we can always do is they have this 3D buildings data. We can give them the flood hazard information and they can choose to how they use that sort of information. We just wanted to demonstrate for this analysis just how residences would be impacted, but it's an absolutely critical component of understanding the entire system.
Thank you. Very
Thank
good.
you.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Well, we reached past noon, so I guess we could stop there.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Have a lovely Thanksgiving holiday.
Yes, thanks again, Nadia.